name is Sofia Ehrich. I'm an art historian, researcher, and curator of multisensory experiences. I spent the last 3 years working on Odoropa, a project dedicated to olfactory heritage, which left me forever curious about the sense of smell. And it is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses podcast for the sense of smell. And today I have Ashok Masilamani with me, who is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Noze, formerly known as Stratascent. Noze is the world's most advanced digital olfaction platform. Ashok oversees the technology and engineering teams at Noze and leads the company's efforts to revolutionize healthcare through the digital sense of smell. Prior to this, Ashok worked as a deep tech CTO at Applied Nanotools, where he orchestrated the development and shipment of cutting edge products like X-ray lenses and Silicon Photonics chips. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Alberta and his Master of Engineering from the National University of Singapore. His undergraduate work was completed at the Madras Institute of Technology in India. So you've been around the world.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a nomad life, hopping from city to city throughout my life. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
sounds
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Well, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining.
Thanks for hosting me. My pleasure.
Great. So, can you start by I gave an introduction, but it's a little bit of a formal one. So, can you start by introducing yourself and explaining your background and why are you working in the field of smell and digital olfaction?
Perfect. So thanks again for the opportunity and your kind introduction. As you mentioned in my academic section, I actually started my journey in the electronics industry. I spent some time in the semiconductor design, electronic system design, etc. And then after that, went back to school. I did my master's and PhD. Largely, it's in optics and photonics domain. In particular, my PhD was in Silicon Photonics, and during my PhD, I explored a little bit of optical sensing, through Silicon Photonics. That was one of my activity during my PhD. After graduating from my PhD, I spent the last 12 years largely building chemical sensors and digital olfaction products. My initial foray into chemical sensing, which has a connection to the digital olfaction field. So my foray into chemical sensing, it started in 2012, 2013 time period, right? When I was leading the development of a gas sensor product, which was optical technology based. But over the next 2 years, I transitioned from building gas sensors to building digital nose sensors. You might wonder, like, okay, what is the connection? What is the difference? When you say digital nose sensors, they are essentially an array of chemical sensors, right? And you can call them as chemical receptor arrays. And it has a lot of similarity to the olfactory receptor arrays that are found inside the human nose. That's essentially the connection, right? Because gas sensors are chemical sensors. Digital nose sensors are array of chemical sensors that essentially act like olfactory receptor arrays. One of the key difference between a typical gas sensor, and this chemical receptor array that I'm talking about is gas sensors, you might have heard about them. For example, you can buy ammonia gas sensor today. You can go buy commercially, but it works like a lock and key approach. It essentially, works for that particular chemical. And if you want to build a system that can detect multiple different gases, you basically have to assemble an array of those particular sensors. You have to go buy them and assemble them, right? So you can build a gas sensor array, but it's very specific like that. Digital nose sensors, which I mentioned as, it's a chemical sensor array. Typically, they are built as semi-selective sensor arrays, right? What does that mean is we, for example, have a aroma chip that is an array of 32 elements. No single element has this lock and key kind of tie with one particular chemical or gas. The array as a whole is semi-selective, means it's cross-sensitive, but in an engineered manner. So if you introduce something like ammonia, like as I mentioned before, it will produce a fingerprint across the array. If you introduce the smell of orange, which is a collection of molecules, it will create a fingerprint for that entire smell. So it basically works with this approach of fingerprinting, right? And in our case, that fingerprinting is essentially a change in electrical conductivity across the array. So we get a conductivity fingerprint, which represents the odor in question. So that's the difference between the gas sensor and a digital nose sensor. And you can imagine, as I moved from chemical sensing, like gas sensing products to digital nose sensing products. Once you have this fingerprint, as I mentioned, the fingerprint captures the entire aroma, right? Whether it is from single molecule or a collection of molecule, but it also captures the background. If you introduce, for example, the smell of orange to the digital nose sensor, it will react to the orange smell. But if somebody is drinking coffee in the background, it is strongly present, it will actually register the smell of orange plus the background coffee. So it actually registers everything as a whole fingerprint. Now you can imagine, if I want to build a solution that can robustly detect the smell of orange with such a sensor, perhaps it would be good to assemble the database of fingerprints of orange in different backgrounds, and then leverage the power of AI methodologies, where it can essentially learn that, okay, this is the smell of orange in no background and different backgrounds, which could be confounding. But the method can essentially learn in that set of fingerprints of orange with different backgrounds, what is the chemical semantics relating to orange from the fingerprint. And you can teach this algorithm to essentially look for that, which means you can essentially build a digital olfaction system out of the digital nose sensor, right? So that is how my work with gas sensors and gas sensor arrays led to digital nose sensors, which naturally led to building digital olfaction systems, which is a combination of the nose array plus the aroma fingerprint database that you want to essentially build for solving a particular problem, and the AI methodologies in combination, right? So that is the journey from what I was doing, and how that correlated to subsequent steps, naturally leading to me working in digital olfaction.
So you started with optical technology?
Yes.
So for the eyes, correct?
I started with the optical technology, but more as a photonics for telecommunication, etc. Right? Like, because fiber optics is also an optical technology, right? And where I was building silicon-based photonic chips, but at some point I started applying them for seeing if we can use them as a sensor, optical-based sensing, because you can use optical technology as a sensing technology for sensing chemicals too, right? Or sensing environments. Camera is one of the optical sensor technology, but I didn't work in camera. I was trying to apply the optical technology for chemical sensing. So that's where I started.
Yeah, so it's just interesting for me that you went from the sense of sight to the sense of smell. So is it because you realized that the sense of smell or detection through the sense of smell was maybe better than for chemicals than the sense of sight is? Or what was your reasoning for choosing actually a much more challenging sense than sight, I would say?
Great question. So I was working in optical technology, but when it came to applying it, like getting into commercial side, I was very intrigued by generally like challenges that are yet to be solved. And that is basically the journey of a PhD, right? Like, you are trying to push the boundaries in domains where no solutions have been done before. And the point where I moved from the optical technology to building digital nose technology, a lot of the explorations I did was largely due to curiosity of me trying to look at the technologies that were there around at that time, which is essentially like, your smartphones started acquiring capabilities, not just to take a picture, starting to interpret the picture, right? Computer vision was coming to smartphones. Your phones were not just recording voice, but they were talking to you. They were interpreting what you were saying. So intelligence started coming into picture. And then I looked around and I saw that, like, we were digitizing, all these different senses through not just the sensory part, but also through AI, right? We were adding intelligence. And you realize very fast that, the sense of smell is really missing. We haven't even digitized it yet. Forget the intelligence part, right? Like, the first part itself hasn't been really done yet, right? So that curiosity led to me starting looking into, like, what is the state of chemical sensing technologies, because the sense of smell is fundamentally chemical sensing for vapor phase chemicals, right? Like, the molecules that are in vapor phase. So that's the curiosity that led to exploring this domain. And then once you start looking into it, you realize that actually there are people that are working in this domain, for a long time. Chemical sensing generally has been there, in a lock and key type of application form, but no one has really cracked the full sense of smell because it's a more complex thing to crack actually.
So this is a great transition for me to ask you, what is digital olfaction and what role does AI or artificial intelligence have in the world of scent? Because for me, this is still, I don't understand it. I'm still in the physical scent bottle world and not the digital world. So bring me there.
So the olfaction is the process of detecting and interpreting a smell, right? The digital olfaction means you have a digital version of that system that can detect and interpret smells, right? The way we detect and interpret it. To understand digital olfaction, let's start with something that we know so that it is easy to compare and contrast, right? Like so that it's easy to understand. So we know computer vision very well. We all use it in everyday life today. The Face ID feature in the iPhone is a computer vision application, right? Because it is recognizing your face to open your phone, but it's actually it's a computer vision application. To build this application successfully, you need three tools: a camera chip, which is the sensor part, the optical sensor, but you also need what they call as a curated, data set of human faces in digital picture format. So you need the data set, which usually comes from the camera. And then you need AI methods, which can be trained on these data sets to learn how a human face looks, from those digital pictures. And once this is done, essentially the trained AI model, along with the camera, in a live scenario, can essentially interpret a face. That's what we are all enjoying as part of the Face ID. So in a similar fashion, if you look at digital olfaction, it requires similar three key tools to build it. First one is you need a sensory chip. So you need a chemically diverse aroma sensory chip that can produce unique digital version of the aromas, basically digital fingerprints for any given aroma, right? I say chemically diverse because smells contains collection of molecules. Different smells contains different collection of molecules. So your aroma chip has to have sensitivity to a large range of chemical families. So you need an aroma chip that has the diversity. So that's the first step, which is the equivalent of camera in the aroma world. And then the second thing you need is you have to get problem specific. Let's say, take an example, we want to distinguish the aroma between orange and banana. Then you need to use this aroma chip to introduce those aromas to the chip and produce the fingerprints of the orange smell and the banana smell. And if you want to be more robust against background smells that could create confusion, you introduce these smells in different backgrounds. So you create a data set of orange smells in different backgrounds, you create a data set of banana smells in different backgrounds, and you create this data set. So essentially, in a similar way like computer vision, we got the aroma sensory chip, we got the data set now that is very problem specific. Now you can apply, this one you need to select AI methods that is very specific to the type of signals that you generate. So once you select those methods, you can actually train those methods to learn from this data set and find the differentiating information that is there in the orange aroma fingerprint data set and the banana aroma fingerprint data set. And you can train the system and it will essentially learn those differences. Because the data set is built with background variations, now if you apply this even in real world, right, where you have your aroma chip built into a device, let's say you bring an orange close to it, it doesn't matter if the person is wearing strong, a perfume, or if they're drinking coffee, it should be able to work despite all of those variations, right? And the process that I explained right now, this is the hard part to achieve because it's not just a hardware part, not just the sensor chip. It is the sensor chip, the problem-specific data sets, and the AI methods that has to combine. So now you see digital olfaction, it's like a platform that can be applied to solve problems with aromas, but you need to go through all these pieces. So AI is not, it's not about AI having a role in the world of scent. AI is part of digital olfaction already, right? Without which you cannot build a realistic or real world working system that can interpret smells, right? So it is already needed. So it's already in there, right? I want to highlight some of the challenges, why digital olfaction systems, when I started this journey, why they were not practically available. this is a AI-driven technology, as I just mentioned. And your aroma data set is very problem specific. But if you look at the computer vision industry, if you look at the voice recognition industry, the digitized version of pictures and videos and sound and everything is already there, right? Like there is, we have massive data sets of them. So someone who wants to enter into computer vision could leverage those data sets to train their algorithms from the get-go. But if you want to enter into digital olfaction, there is no such pre-existing aroma data sets, digital aroma data sets. So you have to create the data sets. Because you're creating it, your data sets are going to be small, which is, not the typical case for AI-driven technologies. People typically work with large data sets. So for digital olfaction, AI is needed, but that AI has to be well put together to work with small curated data sets that are very problem specific. So you need to really innovate there. What kind of algorithms you want to use? You cannot just leverage what works for computer vision here. So you need to bring those methods that are specific for the type of data sets that we have. So we have a data set scarcity here. So that's the first thing. This is why it was not easy to build this solution. The second one is when you build a AI-driven solution, there is this metric they have. They call it generalizability. So in Face ID, let's take a Face ID example. The Face ID, you put your phone in front of you, the camera is actually, lively looking at you, and it's instantly opening the phone, recognizing this is Ashok, this is Sofia, etc. Right? But one of the coolest thing that we experience, but we don't think about it, is it works in every lighting condition. It doesn't matter how the lighting is different in the background. It doesn't get confused, right? It works in all the changes we do to our face. Like, I can grow facial hair. I can be wearing a toque. I can be having a headset. It doesn't matter. It really works well, which means the model, the Face ID model that has been built is actually generalizable despite all those variations, right? And that's a great metric of practical use of AI-driven technologies. So in digital olfaction, you can apply the same thing, right? If you build a solution which is aroma-based using an aroma chip and a data set, and you build a trained AI model, that entire solution needs to work in real-world conditions, right? For example, you cannot say that, okay, my system can detect the smell of orange, but only in this humidity temperature conditions, right? Or you cannot introduce this type of smells in the background where it will get confused. It has to work seamlessly in every different real-world conditions. That's what exactly wasn't there when I started, right? A lot of, great many people had worked in this domain for decades. And a lot of the systems that I looked at, they all would work great in a lab, right? Like where they would have trained the system, they would have gotten a, sensor chip, they would have created a small data set, they would have trained it, and it worked well in a controlled setting. The moment you bring to real world, it will fail. And this is where we actually made a huge stride, and we actually solved for real world application of aroma detection, right? And in my opinion, to my knowledge, at least, like we are the first one to showcase aroma detection in any setting, like, any background, in a conference booth or like anywhere, right? Like, so we are and that's coming from how we carefully selected the sensor technology, how we carefully select, in terms of building the right data sets, and then how we carefully select the kind of AI methods that will, essentially leverage all of this to bring it together. And then we do a lot of testing. We spend a lot of our time testing that can it work in all kinds of different confounding backgrounds, right? And once we ensure that it has reached that caliber, that's when we essentially deploy the models and bring the system to the application layer.
Okay, so now you have to tell me, because you're talking about what you're doing now, but
Yeah.
we need to know where you're doing this and who's doing it. So can you tell me or explain what Noze is?
Yeah, yeah. So digital olfaction and Noze are very intertwined, right? Like, their story is one and the same, depending on what aspect I start with, it highlights that. So we touched upon digital olfaction, but everything that I mentioned to you are the things that we have been doing at Noze for the last 10 years, right? So Noze's story is essentially the same point I started, right? Like where I was really curious about, digitization of other senses, like, camera and microphone and haptics, they all digitized other human senses, right? And smell wasn't digitized. And I was really curious and, kickstarted this venture to solve this problem, because I realized that solving this problem could be applied for so many other unsolved applications, right? Like, aroma could be a huge variable if it is digitized, and if it can be detected in real world settings, you can apply it for so many different solutions that currently don't have solutions, right? That's what drove me to explore this. And in the process, I basically told myself that, like, I don't want to assume that, like, this is completely a new journey. A lot of people have worked on this, a lot of published work on this. So I went and did a full survey of what is out there, what is the landscape. And I found that there are different groups across the world that was working on the space. I found out that the most interesting work in the space, which I thought was way advanced for that time, was happening in Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA. So JPL had been working on building an electronic nose device for about a
Did you say at
decade.
NASA?
Yeah,
At NASA. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Makes
Uh,
sense, I guess.
yeah. Because my starting point was, I didn't want to presume that, just because I had worked in gas sensor space, I would know everything and I can get started on my own. I wanted to really look at who is working on what, and who is building the most advanced systems in this, right? Despite all the challenges that was there, somebody is in the forefront of this, right? So when I looked at that, I realized that there were several groups that were working on some of the most interesting problems in the space. The group at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA, they had been working for about 10 years to build an electronic nose system, and they had produced 3 generations of devices. 2 of them actually were launched to the space. One of them was deployed in a space shuttle and was tested in space for certain applications, and the second was deployed into the International Space Station. What they were actually were monitoring was the air quality in the space station, where astronauts are basically working.
They were using an electronic nose to
Yeah,
evaluate the workspace of the
yeah,
astronauts. Is that what you
yeah,
said?
yes, yeah, exactly,
Why?
exactly.
Why would you know that?
Because a space station or space shuttle is a complex machinery, right? It has so many chemicals that are
Mm,
working in terms of, like, as part of the system, and some of them are very hazardous, and they could have leaks in those systems, right? Like, and which connects with the health of astronauts, right?
yeah, that
So
makes
they
sense.
really wanted to monitor that, and instead of assembling a lock and key type of system, one sensor per chemical, they were trying to build a digital nose type of solution, where you can use the power of machine learning to train the system to look for multiple things simultaneously. So they had built this systems, and they had sent it to space, and it worked for them. And that innovation was there at JPL actually, and it intrigued me quite a bit, and it was sitting as a collection of patents. So I went and knocked the door of NASA, and
Wow.
try to see if they would be kind to, like, interested in licensing this technology, so that we can have a great foundational starting point. It took some time, but we actually figured out a way to work with NASA. We actually licensed a package of 6 patents, basically a perpetual worldwide exclusive licensing. In exchange for equity, they took equity in the company, and that kickstarted the launch of the startup, right? So we got a foundational technology to start with what I consider as the most advanced digital nose system at that point, and that gave us a great starting point to start this entire venture. So that's a journey, beginning, the starting point of the nose journey.
Okay, so now what are you doing with this technology, and who do you hope to serve with the technology?
So this happened in 2015. I started working on this venture in summer of 2014, but the licensing deal, everything was done in 2015, and the venture got launched. One thing about this entire thing is NASA actually, like, built this prototype that they put it in space and they tested it and everything. But their application was not to, scale it for volume manufacturing, like, and put it in different applications across the world, etc. They needed one device, they built it, they sent it, and they innovated on it, right? But when it comes to technology, having that innovation as a first step is a great start, but then you need to convert it into a scalable solution. So for the next 5 years, the Nose team, I assembled a team, and we put our head down, And we worked on every aspect of the technology that we licensed, right? We took the sensor chip that NASA had, and then we miniaturized it, and we improved on it. We added more elements to the array. It's a digital nose sensor they had, which is basically an array sensor technology, as I mentioned before. We essentially expanded the array. So we miniaturized the array and we expanded the array overall. And then we also made it mass manufacturable, right? So that is another thing that we created a manufacturing process. We also worked on the data sets. We basically built an entire system and a team to build curated data sets, that is very problem specific if you want to apply this successfully.
What's a data set in this case? Is it a set of smells that you wanted to analyze, or?
So great question. As I mentioned, digital olfaction is similar to computer vision, and it's very specific to the application you want to do, right? For Face ID, we talked about creating this huge data set of pictures of human face, right? So in this case, when we say data set, we actually take our aroma chip and build it into a device, and then we introduce, the smells that we want to use for solving a particular problem, right? Let's say an example, right? We have a problem to solve, like we are trying to solve like banana ripening monitoring, right, with smell. Okay, then you need to create a data set with that aroma chip, right? Because aroma chip creates fingerprint with the smell, as I said, right? And that's one thing. Like you get one fingerprint when you introduce the smell of banana, but then banana has different cultivars, so they may have slight variations. And at different stages of ripening, it may have different intensities of that smell. So you want to introduce all of these different variations, right, to the aroma chip and create fingerprints for those variations. So essentially, you get a set of fingerprints, and that is the data set. So the more thoughtfully and robustly you create a data set, and basically that's a set of digital files. Now you can train your AI methods to learn from the data sets. In the same way, AI methods could be applied on, digital pictures and train the algorithms to learn how a human face looks. You can train your algorithms to learn from the data set to interpret the difference between less ripe banana versus more ripe banana, because the aroma difference would have created slightly different fingerprints. You can actually teach the algorithm to learn from that fingerprint. So that's what a data set team does, right? But there is one thing. Real world aromas, for example, if you have your aroma chip and if you want to create a data set for this particular case, I said banana, the banana ripening cycle is very slow, right? So to introduce the different points, of aroma to this aroma chip and to create a data set, it basically you need to spend a lot of time to, essentially sample those aroma, introduce to the chip. It takes a lot of time. What if you can generate those aromas in the lab synthetically? Right? Now you can introduce this to the aroma chip, so you can create synthetic versions of data sets, and you can augment those synthetic versions of data sets to the data set that you created from the real world ones, right? So you can mix a small amount of data sets from real world aromas. You can with the lab generated synthetic aromas. Now you can get a much larger data set. This is addressing the data scarcity problem that I mentioned in the digital olfaction world. Now the AI methods can learn from a larger data set, which contains the mix of the real world data versus the synthetic data. And then you can actually make it more robust and make it more generalizable, right? Like where if you introduce the device plus the AI model, can it interpret the ripening process from the aroma variations robustly in any kind of background, in any kind of situation, right? Like, any kind of, it should be able to detect it if there is a confusing background of another smell, like, there is another fruit nearby. Despite that, can you make it work in that situation? There is somebody walking nearby with a strong perfume. Somebody is having a strong coffee, right? Like, despite all of that, can you make it work? And that's where this data set creation is the key in terms of making that interpretation.
And so can digital olfaction replace processes like GCMS?
Yes, it's possible in the future, right? But they serve the two bookends of the overall space, right? GCMS is an analytical tool, and it's a very expensive analytical tool that can For example, take a collection of mixture of molecules or even a smell, and then separate those molecules using a column, and then produces a spectrum, right? It's a very offline, deep analysis tool that is an expensive offline methodology, right?
Yeah,
And
and you have a
you
physical
yeah,
sample usually
yeah,
that you enter into the
yeah,
machine.
exactly. And it goes through a process, and then you have to look at the spectrum. Someone has to look at the spectrum and interpret, okay, I see these peaks, then this must be this smell, right? So it serves a purpose to understand the make of a smell. But if you look at like real world, how nature solves for olfaction is, we don't interpret the smell of banana saying that, okay, this is ethylene plus this, right? We don't do that. We just one shot do it because we actually fingerprint. Our olfactory receptor array fingerprints the smell as a whole thing, and it creates this neural fingerprint. And the brain, which is the equivalent of AI, essentially interprets that fingerprint despite the background smells, right? Because that's how, like, you can smell coffee even if there is a strong pizza smell in the background, right? Your brain can actually separate them, right? And it can generalize and detect the smell of coffee anywhere, everywhere, despite all the backgrounds. And that's what digital olfaction can do. So I don't see them as competitors, right? GCMS serves a purpose for learning and analyzing and understanding a odor and a complex mixture of smells, etc., and that is needed for the knowledge. But then if you want to have a real world solution that is working in real time, digital olfaction systems are the best bet to go in that way, so they can work in a complementary way, not necessarily replacing.
I guess you could say the digital olfaction is a bit more on the human side, I guess, or how
Exactly.
human perception of
Yes,
smell.
exactly,
Okay,
exactly. Yeah,
that's interesting. I think I understand this now a little bit more than I did before.
that's great to know.
Okay, so how has Noze applied or used the technology that you're building already?
Yeah, we have built a digital olfaction system. As I mentioned, we have brought it to real world applications. But what is the best application to apply this for to create a massive impact? That was one of the key questions. We were pondering about these questions, and right about that time, COVID hit, right? At that time, obviously, there was a lot of questions. The world went through a full reset about everything that they were thinking. What we did was we took our technology and built a solution that can basically calculate the virus risk in a room based on the air in the room, actually. So we did that. To do that, we ended up having to understand what the human body emits, like, both breath and body odor, right? Like, and we had to leverage that knowledge to build the solution, and it was very successful. We actually, right after that, we had huge engagement from various companies when we released that product. And we also raised our Series A financing right after that. And one of the questions that we were pondering got answered, actually, because we realized that this is a great solution to apply for healthcare. Because if we can interpret a viral risk in a room from what is emanating from the human body, why can't we apply directly to the human body? Because human body is a aroma source. you know Historically, if you look at it, doctors and nurses actually know very well from the smell that's emanating from a patient what condition they might have. But structurally, we never use that knowledge or practice in a real scenarios, because there is a lot of subjectivity between people, right? Like, where, hey, I think this smell is this. So there is no consistency, so there was no scalability, so it wasn't fully adapted. But using smell as a variable goes all the way back to Hippocrates, right? Upon whom the Hippocratic oath is actually derived upon. Apparently he used to smell the patient to make interpretations. So we realized that smell is a variable in healthcare that really can be a game changer, right? So that's where we decided that, okay, this is a great technology stack that we have built, the digital olfaction platform. Now let's apply this for healthcare solutions, right? And it was also bolstered by a partner that we basically start partnering with, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So they had essentially approached us and asked us, like, hey, you seem to have built this digital olfaction technology stack. Now, can you build this into a breathalyzer platform that can be applied in developing countries for high throughput screening of infectious disease? right? And we said, yes, absolutely. And that culminated in a grant. And we actually immediately went to work to build this entire system into a breathalyzer, for which we had to understand the nature of breath and what kind of aromas that comes off of breath. Breath is a very complex aroma molecule, like, aroma source actually, because it contains a lot of humidity as you're breathing out, and it contains a lot of other molecules that they are not really useful. But there is a section in breath, and it's called alveolar portion. And that portion of breath, in the exhaled portion of the breath, actually contains a large number of rich metabolic molecules, right? That is coming out. And those molecules are coming from the circulation of the blood across the body. So it actually has information about different portions of the body and their health condition, right? And that portion of the breath, which itself is still a complex aroma, if you learn how to interpret, right, and train on, you can actually interpret the health conditions of the human body. So that's what we started working with, right? So basically, we took the amazing technology stack that we built, and then we converted it into a breathalyzer device, right? So you create a fingerprint, and you, as I said, you create a data set, and then essentially you build a solution around it. So that's what we did. And this device, so we successfully did that. Right after that, the Gates Foundation also partnered once again to deploy this to, run a proof of principle study in interpreting whether it can be applied for a breath-based screening solution for tuberculosis. So we essentially got a second grant right after building this solution. Now we are preparing to deploy this in a clinical study, where we'll collect breath samples from healthy controls and patients with known tuberculosis diagnosis, and based on which we'll build a data set of these two groups. And we want to showcase that from breath, we can actually interpret that TB screening is possible, which is distinctly different from people who are healthy, who don't have this condition. And if this is, when we deliver the solution, the idea is that, it could essentially be the front before a full sputum analysis, etc., which could be costly, very time-consuming process. Imagine this could be a non-invasive solution where patients come in, they breathe in, and the screening test says that you definitely don't have a TB diagnosis. Or if there's a suspicion that you have it, you can go for the next set of tests, right? So you can actually triage the entire process based on a high throughput screening solution, which could be very low cost, very effective, especially in regions that are developing currently.
We've talked about now how you're applying the technology. So in this case, it was through healthcare or disease diagnosis. So to conclude the podcast, I'd like to ask you, what do you hope you will continue to work towards in the future with your digital olfaction systems? And that can be for healthcare, but it can also be for other applications.
Yeah, so I have two thought process around it. One is, as we continue to develop this breath-based screening and diagnostic applications with our olfaction technology, our goal is to drive it towards a point where we can get a FDA-approved solution that we can deploy for at least one condition within the next 2 years. Where for example, like, we are running many clinical studies today. One of them is the Gates Foundation backed TB study, but there are other clinical studies that we are running to essentially look at the feasibility of using the solution for diagnosing or screening for breast cancer, lung cancer, diabetes, etc. All of them is going to be with data, will drive us to basically focus on one of those conditions, which we believe in a few years from now we will have a FDA approved solution that we can bring to market and serve those populations. So that's the first major thing we would like to achieve. The second one is, with continuing support from the Gates Foundation, we would basically want to deploy this in the developing nations for disease screening through breath. So that is the second thing we would like to achieve. But in the long run, if you look at it, my dream is, if this device, because it's essentially a platform, you can basically create different data sets from people with different conditions, and essentially build solutions that can screen for different disease conditions, right? So 10 years from now, where it would be like, it's the same device that can be applied for different conditions, and it can interpret different conditions, right? Like, and that is similar to the tricorder in Star Trek. It's almost like you can scan a person and their breath or their body odor, and it can actually give you a sense of their health, actually, like, hey, this person actually has diabetes, and maybe they may be at a risk of developing a cardiovascular condition, right? And that would be cool, actually, just from the aroma profile of the breath or the body odor, right? Like, so that would be the ultimate solution, that I can imagine. But that said, the platform itself could be applied for other, for example, not just it monitors for your health, it could monitor your environment, it could monitor your food that is cooking, it could monitor the produce that you bought, whether it is fresh or not, right? I can keep on going. And the exciting part is, beyond us, many other players are also starting to work on this. So there is a critical mass of people that is working in digital olfaction, and we are super excited because we are bringing it to healthcare, but we are also curious about how others are trying to bring it to other types of solutions. So the future of digital olfaction is really going to be amazing, because the applications, from the application standpoint, sky is the limit, right? You're bringing a completely new modality of sensing, and you can apply it for so many different problems and build solutions for all of those, right? And so it's pretty exciting to think about what is a possibility in the future.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see where you go with this. It seems really, really amazing. So
Yeah. We are all pumped up at Noze in general about the future and what this technology could take us to.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And yeah, we could probably fill another podcast hour with a conversation with you, but so maybe we'll have you back again sometime. Thank you for being on the podcast. And yeah, hopefully we'll pass each other in the olfaction realm again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for hosting me. This was a pleasure to talk to you, Sophia.